All right. Let's see. Actually, as far as I can tell, there are no new performance-related PRs this week. Um, Could have missed something, but didn't see anything on the list. It's been a pretty slow week for new PRs. It looked like when I scanned new stuff. Um, we had two that I noticed closed PRs this week. Um, One for Crimson that optimizes the client request process parallelism. Um, I looked at this at one point a while ago. This has been kind of sitting there for a little while, but yeah, I mean that's good. Uh, I'm actually curious to see if that has any effect. The other one I noticed was that there's another kind of long-standing PR about auto tuning, um, having the manager set the container memory limits automatically. So this isn't auto tuning inside the OSD or inside daemons in general, I guess, but the idea that you have the container's memory limit set automatically based on some fraction of a node's memory. Something I actually confess I don't know exactly how it works. Um, and then our auto tuning code would then pick it up after that, figure out how to distribute that memory within a particular daemon. Okay, so updated atoms do write small PR. I think we talked about that extensively last week. I think the idea now is that we're just going to make flags for when to have do write small, do buffer IO or direct IO, and then try to observe what behavior that results in. Um, so that's still kind of an open-ended question. I think what it should be by default. Um, oh, there's an RGW one here. This OSD compression bypass after RGW compression PR. Casey, I think if I remember, you were reviewing that even this week. Maybe anything new?
Um, Not really. It seems to do a lot more than I think is really necessary there. But I think
Okay,
the core idea is certainly good.
cool. All right. Then the last updated PR that I saw, there's interest again in my cache binning PR, the age binning PR. So the idea here is that um, for all of our LRU caches in BlueStore and potentially anything else that's using the priority cache manager, uh, we would make it so that we can track the items in the different LRU caches uh, and associate them with age bins, where one bin might be the last 5 seconds, another might be the last 10 seconds, 30 seconds, whatever. And the idea behind that then is that kind of on a very coarse grained basis, you can look at what the relative ages of different caches are. If you had one big LRU cache, this wouldn't be necessary. But if you have lots of different caches, maybe you want to understand at a very high level um, what the relative ages of these caches are compared to each other and determine what things should get memory. The goal of this actually is very much inspired by RGW, where in some circumstances you may really want to heavily uh, cache OMAP data. And in other circumstances, you may want to very heavily cache ONODE data. And in others, you might want a mix of both. And it might change over time. You might have a cluster that sometimes is doing BD and sometimes is doing RGW. Right now, in those kinds of situations, we end up just giving half of the memory to each. But this PR, if it works like I'm hoping it works, and I believe it works, the idea would be that over time, kind of a gradual process, not real gradual, but somewhat gradual, you would migrate memory more towards ONODE or more towards OMAP caching, depending on what the current workload looks like, what the relative ages of those caches is. So anyway, Radic kind of did a quick review of it this week. I need to update that PR based on a branch that Adam and I were working on last fall, and we might actually try to get it in here. So anyway, that's that PR. That was all I had for this week. Did I miss anything from anyone? All right. If not, then Josh, I see that core wrapped up. Would you like to talk about telemetry? You are on mute. I don't know if you're trying to talk.
Hey, I'd like to talk about it, but give me like 10 minutes or so.
Absolutely. Sounds good. Adam, let's talk about thinking behavior in the kernel and buffered I/O and direct I/O. If you are ready.
Well, I'm ready as much as I can be. I've been testing on Officinalis why I have different performance for having BlueStore buffered I/O enabled and disabled. And what was strange with BlueFS buffered I/O enabled, meaning I can use a lot of cache in page cache for my any way I want. I had 30% less IOPS in random read writes to blocks 4 to 64K. And more strangely, it was not a constantly lower performance. It was in a mean value lower performance, but by 30%. But actual performance had been fluctuating even more widely, like from typical maximum that I get from unbuffered 12K IOPS to just almost zero, like 1,000 or 2,000. And I made different attempts to find out what's going on, but two results were really interesting. First, if I left buffered I/O for reads, but write path was replaced with direct writes, just using AIO writes, I got perfectly stable high performance. That's one operation I did. And the second thing I did was applying this kind of patch, which we had for some time and then retracted, that broke BlueFS log, just yielded BlueFS log for time of writing. That one was bad because of various reasons. It caused us problems. But for testing purposes, this solved my performance problems. And it seems that root cause is that tiny log in BlueFS, when I'm trying to frequently write to write-ahead log, and the other threads, RocksDB threads, are trying to write to new SST files that are just being created, could interfere. If write-ahead log wins, it's just I cannot see the difference. Just RocksDB works a bit slower. But when write-ahead log from KV sync thread loses, then I get huge performance drop. So the topic for me would be two things. First, I understand it's okay that I start to make BlueFS more multi-threaded than it's currently. And the second, is it okay and is it really sane to use the same data once in buffered mode, but write them using direct mode? And exactly in that direction. First, I write them and I don't read them during the write process like we create any file in BlueFS. But after I finish writing with direct mode, unbuffered, then I'm reading them with buffered mode. Will it have some problems, or it's a valid path?
I think the key thing is that if you ask a kernel developer about that, they'll say, no, don't do it, it's terrible. But the reality is that in the direct IO path, there's sort of a best effort attempt to invalidate the page cache. So the direct write will blow away any pages that are in that page mapping. And so if you read it again afterwards, it'll read it. So it'll work basically as long as there are no racing processes or threads that are also trying to read at the same time, basically. Because
okay, so
if
in our case,
if you had a
I'm
direct
basically
write,
safe.
well, if you are doing a direct write, and while you were doing that direct write, somebody did a DDIF on that block device and got unlucky, they might read the page after it invalidated it, and but it would still read the stale data. So you could have the page cache polluted with valid data, basically. And then the subsequent buffered read would get the thing that was there just before you wrote it. So there is a race condition there that can be triggered by an external process. So it's not
Okay.
It's not recommended, but it'll work. It'll basically work. And
but in our case,
yeah.
the BlueFS is writing, then it's waiting for data sync before it even allows to existence of BlueFS file. So when RocksDB starts to read, it should be read from disk. So I should be okay. I mean,
yes, I think in order for it to be safe, you either need to double check the kernel direct write code to make sure it invalidates the pages after the write has been synced to the device. Or if it isn't, then you need to basically do an fallocate don't need hint or whatever on that same range, discard those pages from the cache. And if you do that, then you should be okay. As long as there isn't some external process that's writing, which we're just going to assume there isn't, like BlueStore is the only thing writing to the device. The only thing is you got to make sure that an external reader doesn't screw you up. And I can't remember exactly. I just remember that the direct IO code does that invalidate thing. I can't remember if it does it before the write or after the write. But you got to make sure that it's basically done after your write has hit the device, as long as it's active. It doesn't have to be after the sync, but it has to be after it's been acknowledged by the device. That makes sense.
But in case when I'm doing a testing run, like from Vista cluster or something, when my device is just a created file, I would have much more difficult time to actually making it safe.
I mean, the code is the same. Like you'll do your write to call, or AIO write or whatever. As soon as the AIO is acknowledged that the write is completed, then you need to do an fallocate, whatever it is, don't need, something like that. I can't remember exactly what the arguments are, but that's the syscall that will basically throw away any clean pages in the cache, in the page cache. Or you need to go look at the kernel code and make sure that the direct IO path does that same invalidate page range, mapping range, or whatever it is after the write completes. I can't remember if it does it after. I thought in my head it did it before, but it might be after. I don't remember.
I will go and take a look, because I really would love to get that extra 5% that I see on Officinalis.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Adam, we can also simultaneously try to get rid of buffered reads, right?
I'm not sure about that yet.
We'll see. Hoping.
Okay, actually, you know what? Here's the other thing, though. If you're doing this, if you're doing a direct write, and then you're using buffered reads, you're always going to read your writes back. Like if the first time at least, and before it'll get into the page cache, and then a subsequent read will work. So is that really what you want? Is that the goal of this? Is not to cache writes unless they're read?
It kinda is, because I
Okay.
don't really expect RocksDB to read my data right after I'm writing them, because I'm creating new
Yeah.
SST file and don't really expect
Yeah.
it need
Okay.
wrapper right away.
Okay.
If it's
And I
write
think,
ahead log, it will definitely not need it, and for SST file, it will take some time before it will require.
yeah. Okay.
Maybe we need to actually verify that the block cache is working properly, which seems like it's behaving very strangely in some. But we're not reading
Yes, Mark, I would
back
really
enough.
like to verify block cache, because it was really strangely behaving, and I dropped it, and let's go back to it. It seemed to push a lot more data into it than it was ever retrieved. That seemed strange.
Yeah, I still feel like that's the key to all of this, is figuring out why the block cache is not behaving the way that we think it should. Because if we can make that work well, it might mean that we don't even need buffered reads anymore. Well, maybe we benefit in some cases from it, but we could maybe get rid of them. Adam, I have to apologize. I wanted to do that last week, and then I've gotten sucked into lots of other projects, so I haven't actually looked at your code yet. Sorry.
No problem at all.
All right. Josh, are you ready yet? We also have other stuff we can talk about if not.
Yeah, I can go into the telemetry stuff a little bit right now. So essentially, what I'd like to talk about today is think about what kinds of performance information it would be useful to collect from telemetry, and and compare that with like what we have today in perf counters, and what's missing and how we could add that. We're gonna have an intern starting next week, help out with this, but I just want to get some of the ideas out there earlier than later. So, like one thought is to try to collect a little bit more information about distributions of I/O sizes and types of I/O. Try to get a better idea of what kind of workloads we see in aggregate. Thanks, Neha. In the chat, you've added the exactly the pad I was thinking of, the telemetry
Sure.
new metrics. It'd also be interesting to see perhaps how this affects the internal state of DOSD and BlueStore in terms of the different kinds of data structures. Maybe what different kinds of like patterns we see in node sizes or numbers of key values that we see. We oftentimes in the past kind of had these questions we wanted to answer about like what does an RBD data set look like? What does an RGW data set look like? We kind of have done that in test labs and from samples of a few different users, but we don't really have the kind of very widespread aggregate data about that kind of thing. It might be interesting to try to kind of group things by workload as well, or by access method.
Within those, like RBD and RGW, we'll have like different kind of sub statistics, right? Like for RBD, we really want to know about fragmentation. For RGW, we might want to be much more interested in things like what's the overhead of OMAP data relative to the object data.
Yeah, that's true. Although I think it wouldn't hurt to collect both, like all kinds of metrics in all cases. It's not like we need to be too concerned about turning these off. But we do need to be mindful that for telemetry, we're kind of gathering these in aggregate from an entire cluster at most, usually like once a day.
Yeah, I mean, I think your ideas are good, Josh. Those all sound reasonable.
Another major area that I can list in the pad there as well is like the memory usage. We often have questions about how much memory is like the PG log taking, or are we using for node caching versus block caching versus other pieces. That could be pretty interesting to see if there's different kinds of patterns or trends that we would miss. I guess one other question that comes to mind with this is how much is the aggregation going to still going to be useful for us? Like if we're talking about collapsing an entire cluster's OSDs and adding all the perf counters up across all the entire cluster. That may hide some detail, like if we have maybe some OSDs that are dedicated for different purposes, like some SSD OSDs, some HDD OSDs.
Even for the memory information, like, at what cadence do we capture that? Like telemetry is doing this once in a day. So is that enough, or we want to think about something else in that direction? I think those are kind of ideas I want to throw off Mark, because Mark, is it even useful to do that, or what would be useful in general?
It depends on the question you're asking, right? If you want to know kind of if you're looking at like a data set over a year, right? One day is not a bad sampling rate. You'll kind of see gradually, okay, we generally know that this cluster is doing RGW, and they're doing this IO size typically, and their workload doesn't change. They're just doing the same thing. Fine. But if you see like that their workload is changing rapidly, some days they're doing this, some days they're doing that. Someone's coming in with a really small IO size workload, and now all of a sudden someone else is doing huge ones. That kind of granularity is probably not going to be great at capturing those details. Some things we probably want more granular, right? We probably want to be able to say, if you're looking at memory statistics, you might want to look at it on an hourly basis. But if you're looking at other things, maybe you don't care.
You could do some kind of like summarization over the course of a day. Like even if you're sampling, you're only sending the data once a day, you could also track like what's the max memory usage for each kind of memory over that day. Maybe even bucket it and saying, so you could kind of say, okay, for this day we've used this much memory for this many hours roughly.
If you wanted to be really fancy, you could look at the standard deviation and then change the sampling rate based on it.
There are still workloads in data center which run daily on different schedules, like nightly batch processes and things like that. So, and usually they run when there is less load with other workloads. That's the way to better utilize the data center. So if you do it on a daily basis, you could get some kind of averages which are not related to workloads which work on completely different times. So I agree with Mark that hourly could be give more information, which is sometimes could be really interesting information about this. So in the past life, I was doing billing for telecommunication CSP providers, and it's batch processes with huge amounts of IOs that are done only nightly.
I think we should just be cautious that we're only collecting data that we think we're actually going to make use of. As, for example, if you're collecting performance data on an hourly basis, that basically will tell you what the daily load cycle is on that cluster. Might be identifying information. Might be able to let you figure out what that cluster is and what's going on. And are we really going to, do we really need like this 24 data points over the course of a day?
Depends
Like
what the question is,
if
right?
we just right. Yeah. I mean, if we just want to make sure that we're not like always sampling it when the telemetry gets sent out right when there's a batch job going on, then like, sample it 3 times or 4 times a day or something like that, which probably isn't enough to like figure out what time zone the cluster's in, but
we could also remove the time component and build a distribution of the let's say memory usage over the course of the day without reference to time at all.
Yeah, like a histogram or whatever.
Yeah.
The thing is that sometimes it's workload of completely different characteristics. So it could be larger IOs or smaller IOs or whatever. So the question is also not the amount of data points, but what you get for each data point. But averaging 2 different workloads could lead to something a bit bizarre. So we need to see whether because we need to tune for both cases, not for the average of 2 cases. If the cases are, if we have 2 workloads and we need to perform it, it's not good to tune to the average of them. But I'm not sure whether, dividing the day into 24 hours is a bit arbitrary. So I'm not sure whether we need 24 data points or 12 or 15, but daily, I think it's too little for sure. But if we want to get some insights into what's going on.
Maybe it's worthwhile, instead of approaching it from this angle, approaching it from the angle of what do we want to know about these clusters? What do we care about?
Yeah, that's a good point, Mark. I think the question I have in my mind is, what are we hoping to know? Or like, what is that one data point that we don't have that we want to get out of this telemetry information? Let us say we start capturing all this information at a daily cadence or whatever. What will we be looking for? Are we going to be looking at cluster-wide information or across cluster information, or what is even the reference point at which we say, okay, this is not what we expected? So it's like a broad level question, but I mean, in general, we can start capturing everything, but what do we do with it?
The question that I used to ask Neil all the time, and he hated it because he didn't have the data, and I kept pestering him, was what do people actually do with their clusters? I have no idea. Like, I don't know what, like, the distribution of like RBD, and if they are doing RBD, what are they actually doing on RBD? Or if they're using RGW, like, what are they using RGW for? I have no idea. Like, I know specific instances, but I don't know. I don't have like a good broad picture of all that. So that's my question. That's my high level question for people.
I have one use case. I'm not sure whether it fits exactly this, but it's a real use case that I try to work on with different things. We have always we try to solve the issue of bin packing pods into nodes in Kubernetes, so we could use less resources. We know from statistics that at least on public clouds we have like 42% of idle resources that customers pay for, and we want to reduce this number. So so today we ask for Kubernetes for specific vCPUs and memory, and it does the scheduling. But so if I know that the max memory is specific value, and I reach this value 8 gigs every day, it's good, but it's not good enough, because if I get it only for 2 hours during the night, and during these 2 hours, I have other pods which do not use the maximum values, then I could do a more efficient bin packing. So understanding more about the max resource use, one number of max resource usage leaves us in a very safe position, but it could be very expensive for the customer. So if you want to be able in doing bin packing of pods into nodes, we need more data than just max values. We need some kind of finer granularity. So I don't know if this is the exact use case for this thing, but it's a real use case that is needed somewhere, and we are working on it in various places. But we need to do some kind of matching of resource usage with all the workloads, not only Ceph, but all the workloads together to try to save money for the customer.
One more thing about this, I don't think it's necessary to have the customer send the data all the time. The customer can aggregate the data locally and
Sure.
then, I don't know, once a month send us a summary, and they can, like, we don't need the raw data. We could, and by the customer meaning our code on the customer side, would aggregate the data, compress, do some calculation, and then send us once a month some information about what they're using, what kind of installation we have. I had some question in the past. What's the average, or what's the percentile? What would be the number of objects on the system? What would be 90 percentile? How many extent should we expect to see on a location? So this kind of information, I don't think anybody have this information. We don't need that information daily, but we should aggregate it and report it. But even some other stuff about cache hit rate. Do we have good caching algorithm? Do we have, what's the hit ratio? Is it changing over time? So we could, is it changing daily when the system is under this kind of load and under that kind of load? So this information could be collected locally and then build nice histograms and then send it to, not the histogram, just coordinate the data or correlate the data and send it back. And there's endless amount of data that we could benefit from. And we could also have developers, when they have questions and they say, could you tell me how we're dealing in this case? So what's the use case by the customer? Then we propagate this question into the field and get the information back from the customer. So ideally, I would like to be able to go in query and have something dynamic, that we don't need to make new build to get the information. So whenever you have a question, go and start asking them.
The tricky thing with that, I think, right, is the concern about essentially identifying information. I don't know that customers would necessarily want us to be able to go and query dynamically information about their clusters.
We don't care about the data. We never want to see the data. We just care about the layout. I mean, as a customer, what do you have to hide about your cache hit ratio, or the number of objects in your system, or what's the if I build an histogram of your allocation, what kind of fragmentation do you have? All kind of, I don't see any of this as secrets.
Well, to play devil's advocate, Gabby, say you have a very low cache hit rate. That might imply that you're working with extremely large data sets.
Then you should find out this information, realize that this is your bottleneck, and go and fix it. There is never...
Well, yeah, from a performance standpoint, but maybe they don't want people to know that they're working on really large data sets. Maybe they have some kind of like really secret AI project they're working on, and they don't want people to know that this is what they're doing. I know it's kind of contrived, but maybe if you were really determined, you could determine, important, confidential information that way.
We don't have to propagate the information with names. They can just get internal IDs, and then we could keep them for ourselves or for, actually, I don't know who is ourselves. There's no ourselves. So some customers, again, in my previous work, I was working in a company, and the customers, all of them being Fortune 500 banks, investment houses. You'd have Goldman Sachs, Fidelity, Bloomberg, Deutsche Bank, and the like. And they were extremely happy to share this information, because by sharing this information, it means they influence the next generation of the product. If they're doing something unusual and we never thought about this scenario, we're never going to build the code to address this issue. But if we see that they are doing this and maybe some others are doing this, then we might improve the code to deal with this scenario. There is really not so much you could gain from hiding this information. And again, all of them, so the only people which didn't share information was government agencies like NSA, CIA, FBI, and the like, which they never give you any access. But I don't think the problem was this kind of information. They just didn't want to give you an API to access the system because you might do something dangerous for them.
Yeah, and keep in mind that this telemetry is all opt-in, and so that I think the idea with this performance data collection would be that it would be a new channel in telemetry that people would have to explicitly agree to sharing, and it would all be anonymized. In terms of like contacting users if we see something crazy going on, and Yurid, I think you had talked about in the past about maybe adding some kind of like optional email address people could associate with their telemetry reports.
Yeah, right now it's already implemented. We were thinking about giving further options to send an automatic feedback to the user. So yeah, that's still not implemented. But if users opted in to identify themselves, which they currently can, and we have constructive feedback to share with them, then we can contact them now already. That's a very good point, Josh. And also Gabby, I agree with both of you. And we somehow need to find the sweet spot between this privacy chaos to figure out how we can help the user on the one hand without compromising any of their privacy. I'm curious how other open source projects are doing it, if at all. Does anyone have any knowledge about it?
I used to work for a supercomputing center, and we had Lustre storage, which is kind of vaguely similar to Ceph, but more kind of oriented towards large HPC clusters running scientific workloads. So this is like 10 or 15 years ago, so it's been a long time. But they did something like that, right? They had like a thing that could run in the background that would gather, it would just scrape a bunch of data off the system and send it to them. We used it. We let them do it for ours because we wanted to get, we didn't want to have to manually do that every time there's a problem in the system because it was so unstable. We wanted them to just have it so that they could then like look at it and tell us what was wrong. So they did something like this, sort of. It was much less sophisticated. It literally just like scanned through a bunch of system stuff, created a TGZ file, and then like sent it to them.
But was that an opt-in basis, and was it somehow available online, even in an aggregated form?
It was not. It was only to them. I don't remember if it was opt-in or opt-out, but you had the choice. And it only worked if your cluster was available to them over the internet. So in this case, I think we had set up special rules that they could actually come in and grab this, or could we push to them or whatever. I don't remember how it worked, but if you had like a totally isolated storage network, it didn't work.
Yeah. Well, for us, if it's also totally isolated, it will not work. But there is an option for defining a proxy and send the data. But I don't know where are the users who will go that extra mile for that. But if we want to have the relation between the cluster and the performance data, which of course we do, opposed to the relation between the cluster and the device health data that we currently do not have any relation between them, we need to be extra careful with that. because of the option for the users to identify themselves and so on.
We could consider not displaying a lot of this performance data in the public dashboards as well, and making it more available just for developers and to the perhaps for the own users' information.
Is there any distinction right now between what a customer might be okay with us having versus what they're okay with being displayed publicly?
Well, they can opt in to channels, so they can decide that they're okay only with opting in to the device health metrics channel. So they will just turn on this specific channel, and they will not send any other cluster data, like crash data and some other basic cluster data. But then once we have the data, we can publish it aggregated, or we can also publish it as is, like we're going to do soon with the device health metrics. But we're not going to do it with a cluster, but at least not for now. So
I have a question. I'm seeing that in the existing data, we already have perf counters from OSDs. So what channel is required for us to publish that, or are we already publishing that? Is that public information already?
What performance data for the OSD?
It's perf counters. If you see the Etherpad, it says existing data already has perf counters, cache hit rate, etc., etc.
I meant that's meaning existing data that we already have perf counters for. We're not actually reporting that in telemetry yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I was like, oh my God, how did I miss that?
Yeah, sorry, I thought the existing data means we're already collecting this. Okay.
So is this exposed via the manager as well?
Yeah, the manager gets reports of the perf counters, at least a subset of them already.
Mm-hmm.
We might want to do even more aggregation, especially since telemetry is only doing this once a day. It could gather much more detailed information than the manager needs.
Is there any way right now for a user to go back and say, we made a mistake, we want to get rid of this data?
You mean whatever was already being sent?
Exactly. They say, oh crap, we didn't mean to export this. We don't want this available to anyone anymore.
That's a good question. I need to find out. Have you ever encountered such a case? I mean, with
no, I'm just spitballing.
No, it's good. I mean, I know.
I've definitely seen other cases where the customers have made mistakes that they want to fix for other reasons.
Yeah, but again, everything is anonymized. But of course, you can try if you have some knowledge. Maybe you can try and understand what the cluster, like who's the user. But we really do everything to anonymize it. We're serious about it.
The scenario I'm thinking about is a poor low-level sysadmin that had been publishing data for 3 years because everyone was okay with it. They get a new manager that all of a sudden says that this is all horribly wrong and that you can't do this and you need to go back and delete all of the previous data. And then they're trying desperately to meet their new manager's wishes.
Yeah.
And it would be good for GDPR just to be compliant to allow just deletion of data.
Yeah. This is the or go ahead. I'll find what I want to share. That's the agreement that we use. there might be a paragraph here that says that they're eligible of asking to delete the entire data that was already sent. But honestly, I don't remember. I'll need to go over that again. And it's possible. I mean, if they want to do that, we can do that. Yeah.
And if you have the agreement, maybe you already agreed to this. No? But this.
Yes. Sorry, I couldn't hear you, Mark. It was breaking up.
Oh, I was just saying, maybe we don't even need to. Maybe it's good enough to say, hey, you agreed to this, you sent the data, we can do our best to accommodate your request, but, this was, you already agreed to the license.
Yeah, we want everyone to be happy. So we don't want to cause any frustration to any side. I'm very optimistic with what Gabby is saying. So that's good. But we just have to be prepared for a worst case scenario dealing with data. That's have to be really careful. Yeah. I had a quick question about the collection of the data. So are we relying on Prometheus for this performance data, or
no, it's entirely based on the performance counters that Ceph uses internally.
Okay.
We report some of the same kind of information to Prometheus, but it's collected directly in Ceph daemons.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because otherwise, if you rely on Prometheus and it's not always available. So, I mean, I know it's shipped with Ceph, but sometimes there are more issues.
Yeah, not everybody uses the same monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that would be really useful if we're doing collection on a really coarse grained basis is to include standard deviations. The sampling can happen faster, but then we can see that, even though this is maybe the average over a 24-hour period, if there was lots or little variation.
Sorry, like Mark, it was breaking up again at the beginning of the sentence. Sorry about that.
If we're only collecting data on a 24-hour period, it would be useful to know standard deviation.
You mean from on the client side already, when we collect it, to collect that on the client side to begin with?
Exactly, right? Like if we're not going to collect data more fine-grained than every 24 hours, at least knowing if there's a lot of deviation or just a little bit of deviation over time, that time period would be useful.
Yeah, I think like the histogram idea kind of captures that, right, Mark? Even in more detail.
It does. If that's the route we go, yes. But if we're really trying to minimize what we send, at least knowing standard deviation would be a minimum. That might be nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think Mark, you're right. If even some performance counters, if we were to export them through telemetry, we should rethink what we are actually capturing, because now it's in current form there might be useless.
Yeah, we have a histogram performance counter type that we don't have on by default today. I think because it would cause some performance impacts when you turn it on. Especially the Sam he suggested is trying to use more sampling with it. So instead of adding every single IO to that histogram, say add every 100th IO or every 1,000th IO.
Yeah. That would be very reasonable.
Yeah, I agree with Adam, and Neha mentioned that also earlier. I think the key question is what and why. We really need to understand why we need the data, what questions it answers, and then we'll be a lot wiser knowing what to collect and how.
Yeah, certainly.
I mean,
I
like,
wrote down some notes in the new metrics pad there for a few of the things we discussed already today.
Mhm.
I'm sure there's plenty more questions we'll want to ask as well.
And
like
in terms
I'm
of
already getting.
go ahead,
Sorry.
Adam. Go ahead, Adam.
I'm already getting excited with new performance counters that I will add that will actually sample the customer deployments, because there are so many things that I'm not really interested on my desk, but I will be really interested when running 10 months.
And there is something tricky about the thing that we need to know what are the answers, what the question we want to answer, and then get the data, because I see the other way around. As more data that we have, we could answer more questions. We could think of new questions that we didn't even think we are going to ask. And if we have the data, we could get more answers. That relates to what I said at the beginning, like, bin packing of pods into nodes. It's something, as much data as we have, we could do some things that we didn't think are possible. So I wouldn't limit. I would try to think outside the box about the question, not touch the two questions that I have in my mind now, and say, okay, let's put enough information to answer these questions, because basically this is a mechanism that could help us improve the system over time in various ways, and maybe some of them are either we don't recognize them at this point in time, or they're very low priority, or we don't think about them and they change over time. Again, the example that I gave is basically driven from work on public cloud, which was not really an item for us 2 years ago, but now it is more important for us. So I would try at least not to limit ourselves to first putting the question and then doing this, but try to think a bit more global way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Information that is easy to provide, and go from this backwards, not doing some huge efforts to something that we don't need. But what we can provide easily, maybe we'll need it tomorrow, even though today we don't think about it. So.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, more data is always better, right? But like when from my perspective, if I were a user, and if you tell me that I'm collecting your performance data, what is my motivation? What am I going to get out of it? Is what I'm thinking. I'm just putting myself in the shoes of a user versus a developer. I'm willing to share my data because I'm going to get X out of it, Y out of it. So that's where I was coming from. But yeah, you're absolutely right. If you get more data points, if you get more data, you don't know which one is going to be useful when. So we can figure out what that basic set should look like. And the other thing that I also want to add is that Gabby mentioned that a lot of Fortune 500 companies are willing to share their workload profiles and performance data and stuff like that. It might also be worth checking and just sending an email out in the user list and in the developer list. What is the sentiment there? Are people willing to do this for the effort that we want to put in to optimize Ceph for their benefit? Those are things to start asking.
I totally agree, Neha, but I think Gabby answered your first question. That what the users get from this, they get system which better fits their pattern. So the main thing that they get by sharing the data is that this data would be used in order to improve the system. So I think that maybe it's not symmetrical. Maybe the biggest companies, it's easier for them because they know they get higher priority in what we put there, and the lower customers think we never do anything. But the thing is, if you share your data, then the system will be optimized to your workload. But I totally agree with what you said about the email. We need to explain what they're going to get out of it, and ask them if under these conditions they would be willing to share information anonymously and see what it is. But I think that's we can explain what is what are the benefits for the customers, because if as more data that we have, better we can make the system.
I have
I
a
think those are
feeling
great points.
that like 99% of the customers are going to be like totally fine and are going to be like great, and then there's going to be like some really small subset that are going to get super angry over something that they did and they blame us for, right? Like
Yeah,
they agreed
see,
to something that they
my
never
only
regretted.
point is that they need to hit that opt-in button, right? If they don't hit that, then there's no point to doing all this. So we need to market us better, or like market this whole idea a little better to like get people on board and start with something. We've discussed a lot of things, but I think we just need the basic skeleton of like even start capturing some sort of performance data, and then we can keep increasing that set and optimizing for what we really need. But we need people to hit that opt-in button, and for that we need to market this better. This is my point.
Neha, I think the only point or the only thing I would really suggest doing with it is figure out what the contingency plan is if they hit the opt-in button and then later regret it.
Yeah. Yep.
That's the thing that I would think really hard about what that means.
I think Yari, as whom I will like defer this question to, is it even possible to do that, or like how do we deal with such situations, or at what point will a user do this?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very valid question, because usually if such thing happens, we can expect even media shitstorm that we are collecting unwanted customer data. It doesn't have to be any merit in that, but it always sounds well in some angry propaganda story. And could we even know what handle that? Because it will happen. I'm afraid it might happen.
Yeah, we definitely want to be very clear and very explicit about what we're collecting, and I agree, like trying to inform users about this earlier and gauging like the level of interest and whether this will be effective at all.
Yeah.
I think we certainly do see lots of folks even on the mailing list who are very happy to share with us all kinds of details about their clusters. But that's only a limited sample size, of course.
If I was a product manager, I would suggest that we may be able to opt-in and have several levels, basic or more advanced levels of things. So from the basic level, we could get some information that helps us. So if you send more information, maybe we could actually get enough information that will tell us how to optimize your system. So something like that. You could send us, and based on this information, okay, your system is not optimized. You need more memory or less memory or whatever. Something in the way you configure your system. So we could do, once we have this mechanism, we could do great things with it if we think about it in a creative manner. And by the way, the reasons I say that if you have several levels of things, it makes people easier to push the opt-in with the lower level, because it makes clear that you get a small enough information, nothing that could reveal too much, because there are more levels. So it usually helps if you have, basic, advanced, and super. People push the basic one. It's easier for them. Just it's a psychological thing, but it's more development. It's more things. I don't want to push. I'm just trying to think out, why customer would do it.
Yeah, that kind of ties into the channel mechanism that we already have. Like you can enable very basic information about the cluster, or you can add extra channels that give us more detail about like the disk statistics or disk performance data.
So for me personally, I still come back to the question I mentioned earlier. I want to know what people are doing with their cluster. Not just if they're running RBD or GW, but what are they trying to accomplish with it? That's kind of identifying, right? But it's the question I want to answer.
Yeah, if you're talking about actual like use cases for applications, I think that's something that we can't really answer with telemetry. It's more of a, it's not something that the system itself knows.
is not necessarily. I don't necessarily care if they're running etcd, but I might care about whether or not they're trying to do write ahead log on top of RBD, which you can see by IO size and the IO type and all these other statistics, right?
Sure.
I could infer it, right? Like if I see a really specific IO pattern with certain range of unaligned IOs that's matches what etcd does, I could probably tell pretty easily that they're running etcd on top of RBD.
Yeah, that's true. I'm just thinking of things like they're running. If you want to say, is someone using RGW for like a machine learning workload, or is storing a bunch of logs, or some other large data set? Kind of, it's much more difficult to understand that automatically.
True.
Again, with
Go ahead.
Sorry. So I'm saying the reason you want to know what they're doing with the clusters is in order to better understand the patterns of I/O. Is this the underlying reason, or
what we should target, right? Like what are our performance optimization targets? What do we care about? If someone is doing, if tons and tons of people are trying to do write ahead logs on top of RBD for whatever it is, databases, etcd, whatever, then maybe that means it's a use case we really need to focus on. Maybe we need to figure out how to make this fast because we're not really good at it right now. We're okay, maybe, but but if that's what everyone's trying to do, maybe that means that's what we need to be focusing on.
Yeah, we should always keep in mind that at least for now, the users who opted in to telemetry are the more savvy users. So it's not necessarily represents all use cases. So that's also something to keep in mind.
Fair point. You could maybe argue though that if the non-advanced users maybe are less focused on really high stress workloads, right?
Yeah, or just users who use nightly builds to run their real cluster. We also seen such examples.
One more point back to Nia questions what the users can benefit. Maybe we could also gather some starting information about performance and build some expectation what could be IOPS, what should be the cache hit rate, and so on. And when customers send us information, we might even do some automatic data mining and come back to them and say, you know what, send them an email. Your setup seems to be getting very low IOPS. We would expect to see 20% more. You should check what is going on there. We think that your whatever setup looks suspicious. Take a look at this. So they could gain by comparing themselves to others.
Yes, that's exactly what I was trying to say when I said we want to market this better. We want to give them some, benefit. Like if you opt into this, this is what we give you, right? And that's when we are going to get more realistic data and, even create those workload profiles that Mark is thinking about.
Yeah. Even cache hit rates. Even if you can say, you should upgrade the memory in these boxes, you'll get much better performance. That's a great thing to be able to tell customers.
I think there's a lot of good thoughts in that discussion, and we're kind of over time now. Anything else folks want to bring up at the last minute here before we close out?
What is the next step? What do we do after this? We already have an Etherpad with good ideas.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things, but I think the first thing is probably identifying the minimal set of things we want to start capturing, and start working on that. integrating that into telemetry. And secondly, I think the idea of reaching out to users more on the mailing list and figuring out is there an appetite for this? How much of an appetite there, or willingness there is to share this kind of information.
How about some kind of like beta opt-in where they agree to just share whatever on the cluster? Like, we don't make any promises about like anything. And if there are people that are willing to do that, then we can start just getting like whatever data we want to try collecting, we can like experiment with it. Maybe there are some people that would be willing to do it. It could be like what Gabby was saying, sort of, right? With dynamically getting stuff. Maybe it's not fully dynamic, but maybe we can like, experiment to see what things we actually care about and what we don't. Maybe we don't know right now everything we want.
I think that would be a bit problematic with the current model of how we collect telemetry.
Okay.
We always let them know in advance what we're collecting. However, there is an option to generate a sample report prior to sending, but I doubt that operators will check daily after they upgrade, how we collect or what we collect now, if we changed anything, in case we haven't put anything in the notes, the release notes. So I don't know. Ted, what do you think about that? About collecting dynamically performance metrics?
It makes me nervous because there are probably some people who would say yes, but we're like asking them to trust us. And I'm sure there are people who do, but I think for all the other people, just the fact that we're asking it, I think would make them trust us less. I think we would have a net. There's some, what is it? In my Google News feed, this thing keeps popping up about, I think it's like Audacious. There's some like audio editing program, and they like have a telemetry feature that's also opt-in, but there's apparently this like backlash in the user base about it. We haven't seen anything like that, but I'm just conscious that I think we need to be careful. So
yeah, Audacity, that's the program.
Audacity, yeah.
That seems very
Audacious
reasonable and fair, Sage. I think you're right to be really cautious.
But I think we can be a little bit more deliberate about what we want to collect, and we can put it in a separate channel and like say like a whole bunch of performance stuff. Like we don't think that it's identifying, but you could imagine in some circumstances it might be. But it'll be very interesting for us to learn about how people are using it. So, and we can leave that channel off by default. If we think it's suspect or whatever, then like we can leave it off by default and tell them. I don't know. I think that'd be all right. But I think it needs to be like not dynamic because that's a bigger ask.
Do channels can they overlap with each other? Is it weird to do that?
Sure. Yeah.
It won't start collecting it multiple times if you have 10 channels that all have the same thing, and it won't
the code is however you write the code. Yeah, we can make it not do.
Well, that's what I was wondering. Right now, how's the code written? Will it fetch 10 times?
Right now, everything is non-overlapping, and everything that's reporting is stuff that the manager already knows. It's just taking stuff in the manager and including it or not including it in the report. So.
So you could have lots of experimental channels. We have this experimental channel for weird data that we want to try seeing if it's useful for us.
Yeah, I think it's just almost nobody's going to turn it on. I think that probably makes sense if there's a specific question you're trying to answer, and you reach out to a bunch of specific users and say, "Can you guys please turn this on so I can sample you guys?" or whatever.
That's exactly what I was thinking. CERN, right? If we go back and hey, we want to see if your crazy big cluster, if it's doing this, would you be willing to turn this on?
Yeah, if we want to understand a typical OpenStack. But the challenge there is that their biggest clusters are they don't upgrade them aggressively. They upgrade all their smaller clusters first until they're confident in They might even still be on Nautilus for their biggest cluster. Not sure if they've moved to Octopus yet. Which means it's like a 2-year turnaround or a 1.5 year turnaround before we actually get any information back. So it's I guess I'm not sure telemetry is the place to experiment like this. If there's something specific that we want, then like we could like write help them script up a custom data collector or something like specific for.
Sure.
Question: is a data sent in telemetry report easily readable to human? I mean, can we build a confidence that at least most of the data that we send is not some secret stuff, it's just uninteresting?
It's JSON, and it's like it's pretty intuitively formatted. But I mean, there's also lots of numbers. So I mean, you could imagine that we're like there's some steganographic like secret stuff that we're putting there. But you can also look at the source code, and it's not doing anything crazy there. So
or alternatively, Sage, you could make, if it's JSON or any other things, you could make label for each number or put more labels. It just would be some more data over the wire, but it wouldn't be like 15 numbers that someone could think that could convey something. It's just put label for each number and people will understand it.
Yeah. I mean, you can look on any cluster, just do Ceph telemetry show and see what it looks like. I don't know.
It's easy to make it human readable, and we give the source. So it's two things. If you are not fully paranoid, you could look and see what is there. And if you're fully paranoid, you won't opt in, as Gabi said.
Yeah.
NSA would not opt in for this. Okay, we know that.
Yep.
It's very.
Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
While you were gone, Sage, one of the things we talked about is what should we do when someone regrets their decision to opt in?
They can opt out. Oh, like should they be able to purge their historical data? You mean?
Yeah, exactly. Like, should they have the option to be able to do that or not?
I don't know. We could.
It's simple to do that, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't guarantee that it's fully gone, but
maybe it would at least help alleviate some of that the issue you mentioned with Audacity. They can immediately just purge what's there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we'd want to be a little bit careful to make sure you can't purge other people's data.
I suppose if it triggered a recalculation, it would trigger a recalculation of the entire data set, then it could be like a denial of service attack.
Yeah, I think it's all database queries, so that'll happen implicitly. But.
Yeah, you're right. How do we know that that's the user? It has to be sent from the same box. But how?
It'd have to be like a secret that isn't part of the published data that matches post or something. I can't remember if there's something like that or not. Anyway. In other news, we're at 998 clusters reporting. So we just need 2 more people to opt in, and then we'll hit 1,000.
We already passed 1,000, but we went back. So
right.
Yeah, it was already 1,010, but we didn't last there. But yeah, soon.
So close.
Yuri, do you have any way to categorize different clusters right now?
What do you mean by categorize different clusters? Like categorize into?
To maybe through labels or some other mechanism say that this cluster it fits into this category well, being used for RGW or RBD, or it's composed of SSDs or hard drives, or there's some way to do kind of clustering of this data?
We do have a cluster X-ray page that can definitely be improved according to actual needs. So if you find anything specific that you would love to see, please let me know, because there's a lot of data, and we've been putting all these panels according to what was necessary and what we think it's necessary, but and there's a lot more that can be done. So if there's anything specific that you want to see, please let me know and I'll edit.
It would be really cool is if you could take the data set and then do like cluster analysis on it, like data mining cluster analysis, where you can say, here's a whole list of attributes, and these are how all these different things fit into it. So maybe you don't even know what question to ask, but all of a sudden there are interesting trends that show up when you do this.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, we need to look exactly at what questions. So, by the way, we can tell that a cluster has rotational or flash disks, but we cannot tell more than that. You mentioned specifically devices, so as I said, the disk information is totally separate. So there is only so much we can answer on that field. So, but there is a huge metadata table for each one of the clusters, which is time series. So questions can be answered. Just needs to be defined. Yeah.
What language is all of this in? Is Python?
Python, and the database is Postgres, so there's a lot of queries there. Lots of SQL and yeah.
Well, there's a long pause here. Should we wrap up or over?
Yeah, we planned to do that like 20 minutes ago.
Exactly, right?
Yeah. But good discussion.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. See you later.
Good day, everyone.
Yeah.
See you.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye.